and let's welcome Dr. Hugh Ross.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are so glad you are here.
Well, thank you.
Amen. God
And
bless
thank you for inviting me back and for allowing me to bring Fuzz along with us, too. Fuzz and I frequently speak on university campuses where we present our testable creation model, then we invite science professors on the campus to critique it and open up for discussion. As you can see with this slide here, we're all about presenting new reasons to believe, predominantly from the book of nature to establish that Christ is Creator, Lord, and Savior. You can engage Fuzz and me simply by texting either Hugh to 31996 or Fuzz to 31996. That's your portal to several book chapters and articles and much more that we're giving away for free. But as advertised tonight, we're going to talk about the Big Five, and specifically the 5 best scientific evidences to show STEM people that God exists. And you say, who on earth are these STEM people? They're people that are in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. That's kind of our target mission field. And we're not just talking about the professionals in those areas, but people who are influenced by them, work for them, and we have estimated that about 1/3 of the entire U.S. adult population are either trained in the STEM careers or they're influenced by people that have been trained in the STEM disciplines. And they represent the largest unreached people group here in the United States, and for that matter, in most other countries. Now, what's interesting about these STEM people, they typically are not regularly attending church. They have heard about the Bible, but they've never really read the Bible, and they typically don't have a lot of close Christian friends. Consequently, we have to use a different approach to reach them. And evangelism here in the United States has been sharing with people how they can come into a relationship with God, but really many of these STEM people need assurance that this God even exists. As it says in Hebrews 11:6, anyone who comes to God must believe that he exists, and he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And traditionally, evangelism here in the United States has assumed that every American believes this. That's no longer the case, and especially not the case for people that are in the STEM careers or influenced by them. These individuals need evidence from the book of nature that there really is a God, not only a God, but a God who cares for human beings. There are also people who not only need scientific evidence, they need opportunities to discuss and dialogue and debate the evidence. That's one reason in arranging to come here this weekend, we've asked that there be lots of time for questions, dialogue, and discussion. And we're hoping when you ask questions, it'll be the hardball questions, not the softball questions. And you say, well, where did you get these Big 5 scientific evidences from? We got them from our engagement with scientists, engineers, technologists who were atheistic but have become Christians. And in interviewing them, we found that there are 5 significant scientific evidences that consistently have been the significant factor, and they're moving from a non-theistic worldview perspective to a Christian worldview perspective. And we refer to these as the Big 5, and that namely that the origin of the universe. I mean, I was raised and educated in Canada. I didn't meet Christians till I was 27 years of age. But for me, it was the origin of the universe. Recognizing that when we look at the universe, it tells us there must be a beginning. If there's a beginning, there must be a beginner. Then the fine-tuning of the universe that makes possible the existence of human beings, and in particular, makes possible our redemption from sin and evil. And then, I know you probably have heard this. How many of you have heard this from people in the STEM careers, that science contradicts Genesis? Okay? Very common. All right. And I found that that's really critical for people in the STEM careers, that they understand that rather than science contradicting Genesis, it actually proves and establishes Genesis and therefore the rest of the Bible. To put it another way, if you can't get the skeptic past the first page of the Bible, you're probably not going to get them to the Gospel of John. And it's the first page of the Bible that raises the most scientific objections. Then the origin of life, and then human exceptionalism. Fuzz is going to talk about briefly the origin of life and human exception. What we're doing tonight, we're covering these big five very quickly, and the rest of the weekend we're going to unpack it for you in a little more detail, where the cookies will be on the bottom shelf. But forgive us for tonight. We're going to be blasting through this just to kind of give you a survey of what you can expect for the rest of the weekend. So, origin of the universe. Now, I started studying astronomy when I was 7 years of age in a serious way, but when I got to be 16, I realized that of all the explanations for the origin and history of the universe, the evidence was supporting Big Bang. And if there's a Big Bang, there's a beginning, there's a beginning, there's a beginner. What has happened in the past several years is that my peers in astrophysics have developed over 30 space-time theorems. And they all are slightly different, but the one that's having the greatest impact on my peers is this one by Arvin Borde, Alexander Vilenkin, and Alan Guth, that states that any universe that expands, and here's what's significant, only a universe that expands permits the existence of physical life. Any universe that expands on average has a space-time beginning, which implies there must be a causal agent outside of space and time who creates space-time, matter, and energy. Now, I'm going to give you a quote from Alexander Vilenkin. He's not a theist, but he wrote a book. He's one of the three authors. He wrote a book about 2 years afterwards where he said this in the book, quote, "With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." And you say, what is that problem? The proof of a space-time beginning implies a causal agent beyond space and time who creates a universe of space-time, matter, and energy. Now, before I began to study the Christian faith, I studied Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Baha'i, a lot of the other religions. But what I noticed was the difference. In Christianity, it talks about a God who creates independent of time. In the Eastern religions, it's God's creating within time that eternally exists. So this is actually establishing the God of the Bible. In other words, there's now a consensus amongst my peers that a transcendent God must exist. Now, they don't use that terminology. They don't talk about, hey, we proved God exists. We have proved an agent beyond space and time who creates everything must exist. But last time I checked, that is the dictionary definition of the God of the Bible. But where there's still some pushback is this God that we've now established must exist. Is God personal? And did he design the universe and the earth for the redemption of billions of human beings? Now, I got a question for all of you as we move into this question. Is God merely transcendent, or is he transcendent, personal, caring, and loving? Who was the first scientist to claim that the universe is expanding? And I'll give you some suggestions. People have said it was Albert Einstein. Some have said George Lemaitre. Some have said Edwin Hubble. How many of you would vote for Albert Einstein? Okay. How about George Lemaitre? Probably not as well known by some of you. And how about Edwin Hubble? Oh, we got a lot of people for Edwin Hubble. Okay. The real answer is Job, followed by 5 other authors of the Bible. And you'll laugh, but this was a huge factor in my becoming a Christian. Picking up the Bible and seeing that in these 11 texts, it speaks explicitly that we live in a universe that continuously expands. No book outside of the Bible said this until the 20th century. And in terms of these 3 scientists, It was George Lemaitre that first talked about the expanding universe. He's considered the father of the Big Bang expanding universe model. But he was actually upstaged by Job and Moses. He was upstaged by Isaiah and Jeremiah and Zechariah. These were the first to speak about the expanding universe. Job 9:8, where it says, God alone expands the universe. It may not come through in some of your English translations. Most of these texts put it this way: God stretches out the heavens. But the Hebrew verb for stretch out is the verb natah, and it literally means the expansion of what's being described. Now, these texts have been so disturbing that when I debate atheist physicists on university campuses, they immediately insist that these are figures of speech. They're mere metaphors. The Bible isn't literally speaking about a continuously expanding universe. But if you look at these texts in the original language, you'll see that the verb natah is used in all three Hebrew verb forms, which means they are literally talking about a continual expansion of the universe. And that had a big impact on me in my late teens, realizing this is evidence that the Bible has the power to accurately predict future scientific discoveries and do so thousands of years in advance of what scientists have been able to discover. Now, I've actually written a whole book, The Creator and the Cosmos, on the scientific evidence we have that the Bible got it right, that we live in an expanding universe. I'm not going to take the time tonight or even this weekend to take you through that evidence, but I will show you a visual demonstration. And this is thanks to the Hubble Space Telescope. So on the left, you're seeing a part of the sky where we're looking at galaxies that are 12 billion light years away, which means it took the light 12 billion years to reach our telescope. Contrast with another part of the sky, we're looking at galaxies 2 billion light years away. So there's 10 billion years between these two images you see here. And I put them both to the same spatial scale, so you can see how over the course of those 10 billion years, the galaxies have spread apart from one another. And if I had time, I could show you dozens of other images that demonstrate that indeed as the universe expands from the cosmic creation event, it expands in a continuously near constant fashion, just like the Bible declared thousands of years ago. And now we know what aspect of the universe is most responsible for that expansion. It's something called dark energy. How many of you have heard of dark energy before? Wow, most of you have. You know, it wasn't discovered until 1999, and yet it makes up 71% of all the stuff of the universe. Isn't that interesting? That astronomers have been ignorant of the biggest component of the universe until 1999. There are reasons why. It's hard to measure. But what we discovered is that in order to have the universe expand at just the right rate to get the stars and planets that you need to make physical life possible, you have to fine-tune this dark energy to better than 1 part in 10 to the 122nd place. Or to put it another way, the fine-tuning we see in dark energy exceeds the best human design achievement by a factor of 10 to the 97 times. 10 to the 97 times. Or to put it another way, what this demonstrates is that the one that designed dark energy, compared to the very best of what we human beings have been able to achieve, demonstrates that the designer of dark energy, at a minimum, is 10 trillion times more intelligent and more knowledgeable than our best scientists. And at least that many times better funded than the US government that actually made it possible for them to build these amazing machines that they have built. And I think you get the point. We're not just talking a transcendent being, because only a personal being can manifest the attributes of intellect, power, intelligence, and creativity, and does so to a degree far beyond anything we humans are capable of achieving. And interestingly, this has been noticed, not just by astronomers like myself who are Christians, but also by astronomers who have been lifelong atheists. And 3 of these atheists wrote a research paper recently in which they wrote about this fine-tuning in dark energy. And when the paper was published, it caught the attention of another atheist, a physicist who is a senior editor for the journal Nature, probably the most prestigious science journal in the world. And he interviewed these 3, and this is what came out of the interview. That arranging the cosmos as we think it is arranged, say the team, would have required a miracle. And basically they're saying, if dark energy is real, this is what we're stuck with, which is a remarkable statement for 3 atheist astronomers to make. And they went on to say in the interview, an unknown agent, namely beyond space and time, intervened in the evolution that is the history of the universe for reasons of its own, which explains the title of the research paper. Their title of the research paper was Disturbing Implications of a Cosmological Constant, which is another term for dark energy. In other words, their paper was saying if dark energy is real, then we're stuck with this agent beyond space and time performing miracles for reasons of his own, and since that is so utterly disturbing, dark energy can't be real. And that's actually how they finished their paper off. This is a direct quote, the last sentence in their paper. Perhaps the only reasonable conclusion is we do not live in a world that is a universe with a true cosmological constant. But here's the irony of that paper. Within 9 months after the paper was published, astronomers developed 9 observational demonstrations that not only does dark energy exist, it is a dominant component of the universe. I don't have time tonight to go into the technical details, but that URL at the bottom will send you to short articles I've written on all 9 of these discoveries, and actually the latest update shows 25, because today we got 25 independent observational demonstrations that dark energy is real and the dominant component of the universe, which means there really is a personal God that is designing the universe for the benefit of us human beings. Now, part of our creation model, it reasons to believe, is based on the principle you see in Job and the Psalms, that the more we learn about creation, the more we learn about the universe, the more evidence we will accumulate for the supernatural handiwork of God. And this is one from my book, The Creator and the Cosmos, which makes the point that indeed, as we learn more about the universe, the number of features, like dark energy, that shows this extremely high level of fine-tuning design has consistently gone up. Whereas back in 1991, we knew of 17 such features. Today, the list is now above 180, which is what motivated the agnostic astrophysicist Paul Davies to say in his book, The Impression of Design is Overwhelming. Now, he was only looking at the universe. The truth is, we see that overwhelming design at all size scales levels. We need a just right universe. We also need an exceptionally fine-tuned cluster of galaxies. We live in the only cluster of galaxies in which life is possible. Over 200 features of our Milky Way galaxy must be fine-tuned for life to be possible. I don't know about you, but it spoiled my enjoyment for the Star Wars movies. A galaxy far, far away. Hey, we've looked far, far away. We don't see any galaxies that meet the requirements. So hopefully that doesn't spoil things for you. But we need a just right star, and now we know that every planet in our solar system plays a critical role in making advanced life possible here on Earth. So come Thanksgiving, our family is going to be thanking God for all 8 of the planets in our solar system. And of course, we need a just right Earth, and we need a just right moon. And it is such that when we look at what features we need in our Milky Way galaxy and our planetary system, we see that the evidence for supernatural intervention goes up. Matter of fact, it's going up at a rate of a factor of 1,000 times minimum per month. So we're on university campuses, we share with the skeptics. If you're not convinced today, wait 1 month and see what happens as we learn more and more about galaxies and stars. But this is what Freeman Dyson said. concerning this evidence. It says, the more I examine the universe, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known that we were coming. Now, if you want to read more about this, we're giving away chapter 15 of this book, The Creator and the Cosmos, for free. Go to reasons.org/Ross and you will get that. And if you want the latest evidence on the design of our planet, again, you can get a free chapter by going to reasons.org/Ross. If you want the entire book, they're out there at the table. And my last few minutes before I turn things over to Fuzz, I want to give you just a little snippet of what we've learned in the last few months that gives us a much stronger case for Genesis 1, demonstrating the scientific accuracy of the entire Bible. Now, if you remember nothing else from this evening, I'm going to ask you to remember this. Genesis 1:2. The Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. It places the point of view on the surface of the earth, below the clouds, not above the clouds. Galileo made the comment that the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to get the wrong point of view. When you run into a scientist or an engineer who says that Genesis teaches scientific nonsense, ask him what the point of view is. If you get the wrong point of view, it will be scientific nonsense. But the text says it's on the surface of the earth. And we get a confirmation of that in Job 38, where God speaks and he says, I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. So it's explicitly telling us why it's dark on the surface of the waters before we get to creation day 1. It's not dark because God hadn't created the sun, moon, and stars. It's dark because between the sun, moon, and stars is a cloud layer that blankets the seas and keeps it dark. So on creation day 1, it says, let there be light. Notice it doesn't say that God created the light or made the light. He did that in the beginning. But creation day 1 is when the atmosphere for the first time is transformed from opaque to translucent. Light could now pass through. Jumping ahead to creation day 3, it says, let the land masses form. Now, I remember back in the 1950s reading texts about the history of the continents, and they basically were saying they have not changed over the entire history of the earth. In the 1960s, I had the opportunity to take a course from 2 of the 3 geophysicists that launched the discipline of plate tectonics. And they said because of plate tectonics, we see an increase in the continental landmass coverage. Now, the Bible tells us that the earth begins with no continents at all. But on creation day 3, we see these continents come into being. Okay, year 2000, geophysicists for the first time come up with a fairly detailed history of the buildup of the continental land masses. And notice you get the most aggressive growth when the earth is a little bit less than 1/3 of its present age, just exactly where Genesis puts it. But a paper was published in late March of this year, and this is now the story. What I want you to notice is the more we learn about science, the greater consistency we get with the biblical text. The more we learn, the more evidence we get that the Bible gets it accurately with greater accuracy with respect to time. Buzz, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. I'm going to pick up where Hugh's left off, and Hugh spoke about the evidence for God's existence from astronomy, the beginning of the universe and the design of the universe and the design of planet Earth. Then, of course, pointed out the scientific accuracy of Genesis 1. So I'm going to continue in that same vein, except I'm going to focus on the life sciences and specifically the origin of life and the origin of humanity. And so when we think about this in terms of the history of life, we're looking at the bookends. We're looking at the very beginning of life on Earth, and we're looking at the culmination of life's history, namely with the advent of humanity. And what I'm going to show is that when we look at the origin of life, we see compelling reasons to think that life must stem from the work of an intelligent agent, of a creator. And then when we look at the origin of humanity, we're going to see that the scientific evidence is increasingly in support of the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 creation accounts, specifically the idea that human beings are made in God's image. So let's go ahead and take a look at the origin of life question. How did life begin? And if you remember back to your biology classes, you probably learned something along these lines, that from an evolutionary standpoint, the idea is that life emerges through a process called chemical evolution, where on the early Earth there are these simple molecules that undergo chemical reactions and begin to increase in molecular complexity, and the Earth begins to build up an inventory of a large number of different types of chemical species. This is called complexification, and that eventually over time these materials begin to self-assemble and what are called autocatalytic cycles form that become the preamble to metabolism, and then we see these systems acquiring the ability to self-replicate, to reproduce, and at that point scientists believe that a form of biological evolution kicks in, transforming these protocells into the very first cellular forms. So this is the textbook description, if you will, for how people believe life originates from an evolutionary vantage point. And specifically, when you look at how origin of life researchers conceive of this process, there are actually three distinct models that have been proposed for chemical evolution, called replicator first scenarios, metabolism first scenarios, and membrane first scenarios. And all this simply means is that, for example, in replicator first scenarios, the belief is that self-replication emerged first, and then the molecular assembly and autocatalysis emerge as secondary processes. Metabolism first is that maybe the autocatalytic cycles emerged first, and then self-replication and membrane formation followed. And then with membrane first scenarios, the thought is that membranes emerge first, and then everything else follows afterwards. And the point that I want to make is that regardless of which approach specifically you take a look at, every approach from a chemical evolutionary standpoint leads to a dead end. The problems are so severe with trying to explain the origin of life through chemical evolution that no matter how you try to explain it, you wind up at a dead end. And in fact, this was really significant for me when I was a graduate student. I was an agnostic when I started graduate school. I didn't know if God existed or not. And when I began to appreciate the elegance and the sophistication of the cell's chemical systems, the first question I ask is, how do scientists explain where these systems come from? This is essentially the question of chemical evolution. And when I looked at these explanations, this was over 30 years ago, I found them to be essentially inadequate. I recognized even then the dead ends that these approaches led to. And over 30 years later, these dead ends still exist. But let me just show you how origin of life researchers respond to these problems. When it comes to replicator first scenarios, there's a litany of problems. I don't have time tonight to go into them. If you're interested, there's a couple of books that I would recommend to you. One is Origins of Life that Hugh and I co-authored, and another book is called Creating Life in the Lab, where we lay out some of these problems with replicator first scenarios. But these problems, again, are so severe that in honest moments, origin of life researchers who are deeply committed to explaining the origin of life through chemical evolution will recognize those problems. One of them is Leslie Orgel. Leslie Orgel, when he was alive, was considered one of the world's preeminent origin of life researchers. And Hugh and I were at a conference in Oaxaca, Mexico, an origin of life conference a few years ago now, and Leslie Orgel was the keynote speaker, and he was looking at replicator first scenarios, and he basically paused after going through all these scientific issues, and he said this. it would be a miracle if a strand of RNA ever appeared on the primitive Earth. In other words, even as a committed atheist who was committed to chemical evolution as an explanation for the origin of life, Orgel recognized that to appeal to chemical evolution is equivalent to appealing to a miracle. When it comes to metabolism first scenarios, again, we see the same kinds of problems. Again, I'm not going to go into the details, but again, origins of life and creating life in the lab are places you can go if you want to explore more. But Orgel, right before he died, wrote a paper on metabolism first scenarios, and this is what he concluded with, that these scenarios require an appeal to magic, a series of remarkable coincidences, a near miracle. And then finally, when it comes to membrane first scenarios, again, the problems are intractable. A few years ago, I collaborated with a chemist by the name of Jackie Thomas, and she and I wrote an article where we criticized the evolutionary explanations for the origin of life from a membrane first standpoint. And this critique was published in a journal called Origins of Life and Evolution of Biospheres, which is the leading journal when it comes to looking at the origin of life from a chemical evolutionary standpoint. So no matter how you try to explain the origin of life through evolution, you wind up in the same spot, basically a dead end. In fact, most people in the scientific community will readily agree that we have no explanation for the origin of life. We do not know how life could originate through chemical evolution. Now, this is in and of itself not evidence that a creator was involved in bringing life into existence. We're not making an argument that because we can't explain the origin of life, therefore God must have done it. But rather, what we're going to do now is show how this very work in chemical evolution actually provides empirical evidence that there must be a mind behind the origin of life. The way in which scientists study chemical evolution is to go into the laboratory and try to replicate the process in a laboratory setting. We can't time travel back to the early Earth to see what happened, so what we have to do is go in the lab and try to replicate the process. This is called prebiotic chemistry. And so what scientists will do is they will set up some kind of chemical apparatus and they'll try to, again, replicate certain steps in the origin of life process. But in doing so, what they end up doing is having to carefully control the conditions in the laboratory to get the chemistry to work. So they have to control the starting conditions. They have to choose the right solvent. They have to add the right materials at the right time. They have to make sure that you have a chemically pristine condition. They have to control the temperature and the pH and the concentration and the order of addition. They have to stop the reaction at the just right time. In other words, these processes work in the laboratory only because you have scientists that are basically jimmy-rigging the system. The scientists themselves, through exerting intelligent agency, are responsible for the success of the chemistry in the laboratory. And the problem is, organic chemists didn't exist on the early Earth. It was a highly uncontrolled environment. And the chemistry in the lab doesn't translate into the chemistry of the early Earth. And let me very quickly illustrate that by looking at something called the RNA World scenario. This is a replicator-first scenario for the origin of life. This was an idea that Leslie Orgel himself proposed in the 1960s. And the idea here is that the very first replicators weren't DNA, but was rather a molecule called RNA. And they believed that the entire biochemistry at that time was RNA-based and later gave rise to the biochemistry that we are familiar with today, which is based around DNA and proteins. Now, there's a lot of pieces of evidence that people will cite in favor of the RNA world hypothesis. One of the most important pieces of evidence is the idea that we can go in a lab and start with RNA building blocks and assemble those building blocks into RNA molecules using clay surfaces. And the thought is, well, maybe this happened on the early Earth. There would have been clay in the early Earth environment, and if RNA building blocks formed, the clay could help assemble those molecules into RNA. The problem is that when you look at those experiments that are done in a laboratory showing RNA assembly on clay, is that first of all, they're done under chemically pristine conditions, where the materials that would have been present on the early Earth that would have interfered with RNA formation or would have broken down the RNA molecules are carefully excluded from the experiments. The researchers have to stop the reaction at the just right time, otherwise the RNA chains will grow so long that they will not become detached from the clay. They become irreversibly adsorbed onto the clay. And if this happened in an origin of life scenario, the game would have been over. You can't have a process proceeding once the RNA is absorbed on clay. But what's also interesting is that the researchers had to use RNA building blocks that were chemically activated so that they would more readily react with other RNA building block materials. And they had to take clay from a particular supplier. They had to treat the clay in a special way in order for it to function as a catalyst. That is, this reaction only works if you have intelligent agents that are controlling the process. And this is characteristic of everything that you see by way of work in prebiotic chemistry. In fact, this is suggesting that unless there's an intelligent agent involved, again, life cannot come from non-life. Simon Conway Morris, an evolutionary biologist, said this: many of the experiments designed to explain one or other step in the origin of life are either of tenuous relevance to any believable prebiotic setting or involve an experimental rig in which the hand of the researcher becomes, for all intents and purposes, the hand of God. And so the point here is this, that when it comes to the origin of life, chemical evolution leads us inevitably to dead ends. And the irony is this, that work in chemical evolution and in prebiotic chemistry provide us with a clear piece of evidence that unless intelligent agents are involved, chemicals cannot transform into the beginnings of life, let alone into life itself. In fact, I've used this argument with origin of life researchers in many instances, and this argument is actually fairly effective. It really gives them some significant pause for thought about is chemical evolution possible, or do you ultimately need a creator? Okay, let's move our attention now to the question of human origins. And what I want to focus on this evening is this idea of the image of God. Tomorrow morning at the men's breakfast, I'm going to be talking about scientific evidence that points to the reality of a historical Adam and Eve. But tonight I'm going to focus on the image of God. And of course, this is an idea that is foundational to the Christian faith. It's foundational to the gospel, because we believe that human beings are the product of a creator's handiwork, that were made uniquely in his image. And because we bear his image, every human being has inherent worth and value. But because we bear God's image, we can enter into a relationship with the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit through the cross, through the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. Yet this idea of human beings bearing God's image, being the crown of creation, as David would describe in Psalm 8, has met a significant challenge in the last 150 years from the evolutionary framework. And the idea here is that human beings, according to human evolution, are the product of an evolutionary process, that we're no different than any other animal on the face of the earth, that there's nothing exceptional about us, that as human beings that are the product of evolution, we only differ a little bit, we only differ in degree from other animals, including creatures like the great apes, and that anything that we think is special about us has already been in place among the great apes. We just display that property or those properties a little bit more than those creatures. We differ only in degree, not kind. This is how Darwin puts it in his book, The Descent of Man. in a series of forms graduating insensibly from some ape-like creature as man, in a series of forms graduating insensibly from some ape-like creature to man as he now exists, it would be impossible to fix on any definite point when the term man ought to be used. That is, again, we differ only in degree, not kind, according to the evolutionary paradigm. What's interesting to me is this, is that even though scientists study the question of human origins in an evolutionary context, a growing number of anthropologists are actually challenging Darwin's conception of humanity. That instead of differing only in degree, it looks indeed as if we actually differ in kind. That we actually stand apart from any other creature that has ever existed in a way that reflects the image of God. One of those scientists is Thomas Suddendorf, who in his book, The Gap, writes this, and Suddendorf is an evolutionary psychologist, and this is what he writes: "We build machines that speed us from one place to the other, even outer space. We investigate and rapidly accumulate and share knowledge. We create complex artificial worlds in which we wield unheralded power, power to shape the future and power to destroy and annihilate. We reflect on and argue about our present situation, our history, and our destiny. We envision wonderful, harmonious worlds as easily as we do dreadful tyrannies. Our powers are used for good as they are for bad, and we incessantly debate which is which. Our minds have spawned civilizations and technologies that have changed the face of the earth, while our closest living animal relatives sit unobtrusively in their remaining forest. There appears to be a tremendous gap between human and animal minds." This is really significant because what Suddendorf is arguing, again, from within the context of the evolutionary framework, that presumably humans and chimps share an evolutionary ancestor. And what he's arguing is that when these two lineages diverge, what we see with chimps are creatures that are on the verge of extinction as the rainforests disappear. And on the other hand, you have human beings who in that same period of time have sent people to the moon. And he argues that there must be something different about us that makes that possible. And it turns out that what makes us different are four qualities. Symbolism. We have this ability to represent the world with symbols, to represent abstract ideas with symbols. And we can communicate those ideas with one another through language and music and art. We have what's called open-ended generative capacity. We can embed symbols within symbols to create alternative possibilities. We have theory of mind, where we recognize that other people have minds like us, and we desire to link our minds together, and we do so in these complex social hierarchical structures. And these combination of properties are unique to human beings, and I would argue that these are merely scientific descriptors of what we would understand to be the image of God as human beings. Now, what about Neanderthals? Many of you maybe are familiar with Neanderthals and the idea that Neanderthals were our evolutionary predecessor, and they made music and art and buried their dead. And even though these claims exist in the scientific literature, there are many researchers who dispute those claims. It's a highly contentious area. But to me, what is really interesting about Neanderthals that again highlight the exceptional nature of human beings is the trajectory that Neanderthal technology took compared to the trajectory of human technology. Neanderthals were on Earth longer than we've been on Earth, and their technology was crude and cumbersome compared to ours, and it remained unchanged. Human beings show up on the scene, and the technology we develop explodes. It takes an exponential growth in terms of its trajectory. This is what Ian Tattersall and Noam Chomsky and some other collaborators said in a journal article. Our species was born in a technologically archaic context, and significantly, the tempo of change only began picking up after the point at which symbolic objects appeared. Evidently, a new potential for symbolic thought was born with our anatomically distinct species. but it was only expressed after a necessary cultural stimulus had exerted itself. The stimulus was most plausibly the appearance of language. Then, within a remarkably short space of time, art was invented, cities were born, and people had reached the moon. This is highlighting again our exceptional nature compared to Neanderthals, and the key seems to be our capacity for symbolism. And of course, again, symbolism is manifested in the form of language. And one of the things that's really interesting is that when we look at the origin of language, instead of language evolving from a simple, crude form to a complex form, the latest work from scientists working on the origin of language says that language seems to appear suddenly out of nowhere. It appears when human beings first appear on Earth, and it's unique to human beings. And in fact, our language structure at its inception was as complex as language is today. This is what a Japanese researcher by the name of Shigeru Miyazawa says. The hierarchical complexity found in present-day language is likely to have been present in human language since its emergence. Tattersall and Chomsky and others said this in a journal article on the origin of language. By this reckoning, the language faculty is an extremely recent acquisition in our lineage, and it was acquired not in the context of slow, gradual modification of pre-existing systems under natural selection, but in a single, rapid emergent event that built upon those prior systems but was not predicted by them. The relatively sudden origin of language poses difficulties that may be called Darwin's problem. Scientists cannot explain how language could emerge suddenly out of nowhere from an evolutionary standpoint. But if human beings are made in God's image, what would it look like? That as soon as human beings appear on the scene, language shows up, and evidence for that language is found in our symbolic capabilities and the trajectory that our technology took. So when it comes to the origin of humanity, and particularly the image of God, we see the same thing as we do with the origin of life. Work to try to understand the origin of humanity in an evolutionary context has surprisingly produced evidence that supports the biblical notion that human beings are made in God's image, validating the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 creation accounts. I'm going to go ahead and end by just simply pointing out that, as Hugh did, that if you text Fuzz to 31996, you can gain access to a couple of book chapters from Origins of Life, as well as a video showing how biochemistry was critical in my conversion to Christianity.